In the Image of Man. Copyright Mark Long. Chapter 1. The asteroid tumbled in space, end over end and twisting. Microwave pulses bounced off as it neared the planet, reflecting off the complex angles of the surface. The pulses came from a trio of missiles curving up from the planet to meet it. The asteroid was accelerating towards the planet below, its path curving as the gravity of the blue-green world distorted space. The missiles were angled to meet the mass of rock where it would be, not where it was. The 56,000-ton mass gained velocity with each second that passed, and each meter nearer to the Earth. On the planet below, almost every television channel relayed a broadcast showing the asteroid, and people around the world watched, hoping and praying that the danger would pass. One of the nuclear-tipped rockets pulled slightly ahead of the others as the gap between the makeshift weapons and the tumbling rock narrowed. There was a blinding flash, soundless in the vacuum of space. The billions below gasped a breath and held it as their TV screens went dark. Chapter 2. It was a rainy night, not a good time to be standing in a lay-by on the A34, trying to hitch a ride. Jason cursed himself for asking to be let out here, but the driver of the Volvo had been singing along to Radio 2, and you had to draw the line somewhere. Also, driving gloves. In Jason's opinion, you could tell a lot about a man that wore driving gloves. After the festival, it was too much even in exchange for a ride, and he left while he still remembered what proper music sounded like. He pulled his windbreaker hood forward to cover more of his face, and stuck his thumb out again. He fumbled to light his last joint one-handedly, the wind and rain making it nearly impossible. The driver of the truck saw the hitchhiker in the high beams of the truck ahead, and thought that he looked like a half-drowned puppy. You always saw them at festival time. He certainly had nothing against hippies. He'd been one back in the day, and he still had a soft spot for them. He'd thumbed his way back from a happening more than once back in the innocence of youth, and knew how it felt to be passed by every damn car. He wasn't supposed to have passengers, but sod it. The system couldn't be smashed, but sometimes you had to stick it to the man. He indicated left and hit the brakes. It was going to be a bit tight, but he could help. There was a slick of diesel and water over the right side of the road, and the trailer slewed to the left. The driver tried to compensate, but the load of washing machines weighed more than the cab, and by the time the correction took effect, the road surface had changed. The load went sideways, half on the road and half into the lay-by, grass whipping at the underside. Jason looked at the side of the truck coming at him without understanding, his mind frozen with the suddenness of it. The spray of water coming from the tyres, the dirty red of the sides, the oddly cheerful Rupert the Bear crucified on the front, the metal bar that was suddenly in his face. Time slowed in his last moments, and his mind flashed back a few years to his childhood, to his own toy bear. He never had trusted that smug bastard. His head snapped back, his spinal cord severed. He flew back, hitting the concrete barrier solidly. Jason died without ever realizing that he was hurt, his last emotion being surprise, the scrawled graffiti telling him to peace out unseen. He would have appreciated it had he known. The lorry jackknifed to a stop, the cab and truck mirroring him, both necks broken. It was an end. It was also a beginning. 3 days later, the sun was shining and the road was dry. The mark of tyres were a scribble on the road surface, and the mud was still raw where it had been churned up. Jason's father, mother, and sister stood near the spot where he had died and wept quietly. Tears fell from the faces of the family and made dark spots on the scuffed ground. It seemed such an ordinary place, too ordinary for something so awful to have happened. Jason's family put together a makeshift shrine out of ribbons, CDs of his favourite bands, a graduation photo, and an old, and distinctly not Rupert-like, teddy bear. It wasn't much to mark a life, but they wanted to believe that it made a difference. It was an undirected belief. It stayed with the shrine. Something, a nameless thing, watched, at first without understanding or awareness. It was still watching long after the tears had dried from the road. Chapter 3. The spirit floated nameless and unaware. It was not the spirit of Jason. That had gone to wherever such spirits go. This was an older thing, a being that had come into existence with the atoms of the world. It had been at the heart of stars, in vast dust clouds, and now by a roadside. It had experienced such things, but not known them, because it was without thought. It felt the pull of the belief pooled around the relics of a life lost too soon, and it was drawn to it. It drank of the belief, and became aware of itself. It drank a little more and became aware of its surroundings. People went by in cars, trucks, and sometimes motorcycles, all moving too fast for the spirit to understand them, except as things that believed. Some of the minds were sharp, but most were dull, idling while their hands guided their vehicle. The spirit slowly feasted on the belief, gained sentience and ability as it depleted the pool. It became aware of its hunger and its limits. It needed belief if it was to remain itself, not return to being one of the countless billions of spirits that existed without knowing. It would need belief, and those things in the cars had some. The spirit rationed itself, taking no more from the pool than it needed. There was very little left by this point. Mr. Ray Charles was a vending machine repairman. He was aware of the famous Ray Charles, and he considered the coincidence of names to be one of the few interesting things about himself. He would often introduce himself as Ray Charles, no relation, but it increasingly got him baffled looks as younger people tended not to be familiar with the American soul-singing legend. He was driving along with Radio 4 droning on in the background when the car started juddering. It was a rather battered silver Vauxhall Cavalier that the company supplied so that he could ensure that the supply of chocolate bars, crisps, and slightly tired sandwiches could continue to be vended at ludicrous prices to people with no time to get better food. Mr. Charles sighed and pulled into the lay-by, his tyre bumping and flapping as he did so. A stray bolt from a truck had gone through the tread. Mr. Charles did what any practical man would. He swore and got out of the car to look at the tyres. The front near side would never be the same again. Being a prudent, pipe-smoking kind of fellow, he carried a spare tyre, a jack, one of those odd spanners, and a warning triangle in the boot of the car. He also carried tools and spare parts for vending machines, but that need not concern us here. The triangle was set up, and the tools and spare tyre methodically brought to the appropriate place on the car. Mr. Charles liked things to be done properly. It was the swearing that brought the spirit to the scene. These things have power in the world of spirits. Hatred of a god is as much a belief as a prayer, and while Mr. Charles's curse was a very minor one, Mrs. Charles having strong views on immoderate language, it was better than nothing to a hungry spirit. He watched as Mr. Charles took off his jacket, retucked his shirt, pulled off the hubcap, and loosened the bolts of the wheel. He watched again as the car was lifted by the jack, and the wheel removed. All of this was utterly new to the spirit, but he was an attentive audience. Mr. Charles was a sensible man, so he put the 4 bolts from the wheel in the dish of the hubcap so they wouldn't get lost. It was a fine and sensible plan, right up until the moment when he stepped on it, catapulting the bolts into the long grass by the side of the road. Another curse arrived as a bonus. The spirit watched all this with fascination, but with limited understanding. The process of changing the tyre was as new an experience as was the proximity to a person. The mind of Mr. Ray Charles shaped the spirit in new ways, its mind as malleable as fresh clay. If Mr. Charles had been a different person, subsequent events would have gone in a very different direction, but Ray was a fundamentally decent person, and the hungry spirit was fed well. Mr. Charles scrabbled in the grass, the sun gleaming off his bald spot, carefully trying to avoid grass stains on his blue suit, and managed to find 3 of the 4 bolts fairly quickly, but the 4th was more elusive. Time was ticking on, and Mr. Charles had a schedule to keep. "Oh, for God's sake, where is the damn thing?" he cried. That was close to a prayer. The difference between a god and a spirit is only one of belief. The spirit exulted for a moment because he'd never had anyone ask anything of him before. The feeling was one of authority and importance. Clearly the spirit needed to answer the prayer. Burning bushes were not an option, as they would have taken far more power than he had. Besides, there were only scrubby and slightly damp grass on the side of the road. Displays of lightning would have been even harder, and creating a new wheel bolt out of raw belief was out of the question. Damnation of the bolt was relatively easy, but he wasn't going to get any belief out of that, and it was also pointless since there was no soul in the steel. The best that he could do was to reveal the location of the hidden bolt. Drawing the last of the power from the shrine, he created his first miracle, bending 2 blades of grass a tiny distance, rather less than a centimetre. It wasn't much, but it let the sun through to glint on the oily metal. Once, twice, and then Mr. Charles saw the little flicker of light. He scooped up the bolt with a triumphant cry, "I'm Bob's your uncle!" The name of the spirit became known as Bob, even if only to himself.